Hi everyone. I'm just going to say a few things here to contextualize and explain the logical vocabulary lexicon that I gave you, going along with the philosophical vocabulary lexicon that I posted a short lecture about yesterday. I don't think I have as much to say here, especially not in the kind of philosophical and abstract sense. I just want to walk through primarily a couple of things on the worksheet just to make sure it's clear. I will say about logic in general, I do really encourage you to take a logic class at some point. You can do that at Villanova. It's necessary if you want to be a philosophy major, but even if not, it's really helpful just to sharpen your thinking, give you tools for reasoning, tools for arguing. If you've ever felt like you're in an argument with someone and you believed what you were thinking, but you just couldn't you just couldn't win the argument. The person you were talking to is just better. Well, taking logic will help you with that. That's what it does. It's a kind of argumentative weapon. Logic is the grammar of argumentation. It's kind of the rule book of argumentation. And yeah, logic is all about arguments. Obviously, we make arguments in philosophy, and we're going to focus explicitly on how to make arguments, especially in writing throughout this course. But all academic pursuits make arguments. When a scientist claims something about a new species that they've found, they need to make an argument to establish that this is a new species that we need to account for, that has different properties from what we're used to, etc. When a historian makes a claim, it might not sound argumentative, like when a philosopher says, Socrates is a man, men are mortal, all men, or Socrates is mortal, but the historian is still making an argument. And he or she says, the Revolutionary War in America happened for this reason. There are arguments involved in establishing any kind of knowledge. That's how we use discipline and restraint and a kind of common set of rules to pursue the truth, ultimately, across the academy. So, that's all I really want to say by way of contextualization. I just want to walk through the various terms on the logical lexicon that I gave you here. So think about everything on the first page of this as basically two sets of concepts. So argument, claim, and reasons all go together. You can see the definitions and explanations for them there. Kind of parallel to that is premise and conclusion. And in a certain sense, you could substitute premise and conclusion as also a part of an argument. I explained this a little bit in writing on the sheet. I hope you'll read that carefully, but I realize that there could be confusion about what's the difference between a claim and a premise. Why are we using both of these terms? I don't want you to worry a lot about that, and I'm not testing you on that on the quiz or anything. They're in some cases interchangeable. It's not something to stress about. In general, I will refer to the terms claim and reason when we're talking about writing. Those are terms that are especially useful for writing mechanics. Every paper that you're going to write should consist of a claim and a reason. Reasons for believing that claim, and the claim together with those reasons is the argument, which is the entire kind of skeleton of the paper. Premise and conclusion just refer a little bit more theoretically to parts of arguments as such. So if we're kind of talking out loud, or not talking about producing a certain product, like a written product, but we're just arguing, then I'll refer to premises and conclusions. I'll say something like, well, I don't think your conclusion is valid because you mentioned this one premise, and I think I have a reason to disagree with that premise. Premises and conclusions go together in a kind of necessary way. I said in the last lecture that a lot of times philosophical terms are most meaningful in pairing in relation to other terms that are opposite to them or functioning alongside them in some way. That goes for premises and conclusions. Premises are steps on the ladder leading to conclusions. Conclusions are what you get when all of your premises add together in a logical way. Okay? So that's those. The others are a little bit more randomly organized here. Validity is just the logical way of saying acceptable or potentially correct. So here's a distinction that maybe I should make. To say that an argument is valid is not the same as to say that it's true. Okay? To say that it's valid means that in a logical sense, its premises add up to its conclusions. Its conclusion follows naturally from the premises designed to lead to that conclusion. That can be entirely true, and you can still find reasons to disagree with that, right? That kind of concerns a different level of argumentation. At that point, you kind of step outside of the particulars of the argument itself and have to challenge it sort of from the outside. Within logic, we are challenging arguments from the inside. We challenge them on the basis of validity. Even if an argument is accepted as valid, you can find reasons to say, well, this doesn't really map onto reality, or this doesn't actually explain or illuminate reality in a truthful way. So validity is not the same as truth. However, validity is, most philosophers would agree, a prerequisite for truth. So to just say that again, maybe more simply, an argument can be valid and untrue, but it cannot be invalid and true. So validity is a prerequisite for truth, but is not a sufficient condition for truth. Inference is what happens when you move from a premise to a conclusion. And I think I've asked for you to use that power a bit on the logical quiz that you have for tomorrow night. Just means, I mean, you've maybe heard this term in like English classes and things like that. To infer specifically means to move from a certain premises to making the mental leap of what those premises imply as a conclusion. Affirmation and negation, again, these are examples of pairs that make most sense together. And this is another place where I need to say, where I need to kind of disambiguate a philosophical term from everyday language. Negative isn't necessarily a bad thing in philosophy. Negation isn't necessarily a bad thing at all. It's just one of the alternatives for logical argumentation. When you get to writing your papers, you basically will have a choice, and everyone will make this choice of whether to make an affirmative or a negative argument. So you'll be writing about particular authors, trying to identify the arguments that they've made in the text that we're going to read. Sorry. And saying basically either I affirm this or I negate this. So you're either going to say to posit, which is another word that kind of goes along with affirmative. Posit is actually the root of the word positive. You're either going to posit an affirmative argument, this author's argument is correct and I support it for these reasons, or you're going to negate that argument. This author's argument is incorrect for the following reasons. Okay? A lot of these logical things might seem more concrete once we get down to talking about writing, because logic is very important to the argumentative structure of writing good essays, especially in philosophy. And the last thing, yes, the last just inductive versus deductive arguments. I've gone into a fair amount of explanation of those on the sheet, so I'm not going to say much about them in any depth. Again, obviously this is one of those famous pairings in philosophy. Inductive arguments, there's a sense in which philosophers can prefer deductive arguments. I mean, a lot of philosophers who especially have tried to reduce all argumentation to logic would like to reduce all knowledge to the form of deductive arguments, just everything following logically in an airtight way from basic premises. But I mean, actually most of the argumentation that we engage in everyday life, in political debate, also in the academy and academic discourse, even in more kind of everyday settings, it's usually inductive, because we usually can't be completely certain of what we're talking about. Deduction operates by basically moving concepts around. Deduction is literally deducing truths from what is contained in the concept that you begin with. So, in saying, again, this, I've mentioned this argument before, this is kind of the standard, Socrates is a man, men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's an argument in which it's the concept of man is what's really being operated on there. We're saying that you can't think of the concept of man without including mortality in it. As long as you accept that premise, that men have to be mortal, then it just follows naturally from the structure of the concept that Socrates is mortal. So it's a pretty solid, irrefutable conclusion, but the kinds of arguments that we can make through deduction are also limited. Induction is really much more available to, as I say on the sheet, the avenues of regular human life, which are often messy, which often can't be reduced to necessary conclusions following from premises. That's all I have for today. I will be in touch for the next 2 days and over the weekend, and getting everything ready for next week. Just be sure to keep up with the announcements and everything on Blackboard, and I will talk to you soon.